Okay, I have some requests. For the first one is to discuss evidence for evolution. So this kind of question comes up a lot, and if you are reading a source or you are reading a question and it asks you what evidence is there, then you always go with evidence of evolution, and there are a whole lot of evidences of evolution. But what I find is that there are some obvious ones which I'm going to go through now, but there's some that are not very obvious, and I think those ones that are not very obvious are always good to just discuss quickly, just to have an idea. So you can say you've heard of them in case in a case study or in an essay you get told new stuff, because you can. I mean, obviously that's the whole point of a case study, is that you're going to be exposed to things you haven't necessarily been exposed to before. Okay, so let's go through what I mean. So evidence for evolution, this is proof that the evolutionary theory is correct. And I think it's important to understand that an evolutionary theory is not a hypothesis. It's not something that needs to be tested. It's something that is based on a very big body of evidence. And that's the idea of an evolutionary theory. So you have the obvious ones. Okay, so the first one would be fossils. Fossils are good evidence for evolution. And you can look at the fossil records. So you can look and see what organisms existed, when they existed, possibly what evolved into what. And there are lots of different examples. The horse is an example of fossils, that you've pretty much got every fossil as a complete fossil record. But there are problems with the fossil record. The main problems would be things like that it's incomplete, that not everything has fossilized. Anything with soft bodies doesn't fossilize, that the conditions have to be perfect. This is grade 10 work, that conditions have to be perfect for fossilization to occur. So if the conditions aren't perfect, then you'll never get fossils. And that's, by the way, why South Africa and Africa, because the Great Rift Valley, are really so important with fossils, because they have these fossil sites, the cradle of humankind and the Great Rift Valley, where there are so many fossils found because the conditions were correct, okay, for ideal for fossilization. Okay, so that's fossils. And of course you can look at the fossils and you can compare the fossils, especially with hominids, and you can see similarities and differences. But I'm going to do a whole separate hominid video. We'll discuss that in more detail. The second main one is genetics, or DNA. So if you compare DNA and there are similarities in the DNA, or more similarities, then that means that they are more closely related. If there are not so many similarities or more differences, then that shows that they are more distantly related. You can draw a cladogram from that, looking at percentage similarity of DNA. That's a good way of, or a phylogenetic tree. It's a good way of doing that. So that is a second example of went on a little tangent there, of evidence. Okay, then there's biogeography. Biogeography is interesting. It often works with fossils. They're not always by themselves. The idea of biogeography is the distribution of organisms around the world, and if you find similar organisms on different land masses, that means most likely that the common ancestor was found on all those land masses, so maybe before they split, and then divergent evolution would have happened after that. It's not always the case. Just be careful with biogeography, because sometimes what can happen is you'll have similar organisms on different land masses, but it's due to convergent evolution, similar selection pressures. I don't know if you can hear the airplane. Okay, so it just depends on, you've got to obviously read sources, but that's biogeography, the distribution of plants and animals. Then you have modification by descent. So this is basically how things are passed down, but differences happen, so that there are similarities between organisms and their parents and their past generations, but there are also differences, modifications through the generations, and that is evidence of evolution, that we're not all the same, we're not absolutely identical as our ancestors, that this descent with modification, either way you can say it, is that there are differences that accumulate. That would be due to mutations. We can also look at biochemistry, which is looking at comparing like just different proteins that we have, but that's obviously linked to genetics. And then there are some interesting ones. So these are the ones I like. So embryology, and I haven't worked out how Instagram works, I can't do any pictures behind, but hopefully these are still helping you, because lastminute.com kind of stuff. So embryology is a really, really interesting one for me, because embryology if you look at, you can go and Google this, if you look at the embryos of us and salamanders and fish and pigs and cows and sheep and chickens. The first stage of embryological development, we are all the same. We all look the same. We have gill slits, we have tails. Obviously through the development in the womb, we change and they change, and the fish keep their tails, and the, you know, and all these things change. But our first stage of embryological development is exactly the same. And that means that we must have come from a common ancestor. So this is, remember, evidence for evolution. So a common ancestor to all of those organisms existed however many millions of years ago. And the other one I really like is vestigial structures. The word vestigial means small and non-functional. So we think of the coccyx, we think of the appendix, even though the appendix possibly does have some kind of some function, but we're not going to go into that in too much detail. But anything that has been lost because we don't use it anymore, but it's still present. So there are a few examples, and I want you to think of Lamarck's law of use and disuse when I go through this example. The best example for me is the whale pelvis. Now whales, the ancestors of whales were actually quadrupedal animals living on land that went back into the ocean, and therefore they lost their legs. So now, because they don't need legs, because they've got a huge tail and they've got the dorsal fin and the other fins and all of those things, they didn't need legs. They became cumbersome. What happened was they lost their legs, but the pelvis remained. They don't need the pelvis. The pelvis has got no use in a whale, but it's still there. It's small, it's vestigial, it's tiny, but it's still there because it's a remnant of the evolutionary past. So that's a nice example of a vestigial structure. And if you think of Lamarck's evolution of, or use and disuse, this would be a perfect example of disuse. They did not use their hind legs, they lost them, and therefore the pelvis, because it wasn't being used, got smaller. So that's an example of when Lamarck actually is correct. Okay, so those are, for me, the main evidences of evolution. They're just a few things. Divergent evolution does prove evolution because it does show a common ancestor that has a specific structure. So I always think about the pentadactyl limb. The 5 parts to the limb. You've got the humerus, the radius and the ulna, the carpals, which are your wrist bones, the metacarpals, your hand bones, and the phalanges, your finger bones. That pentadactyl limb is an example of, there was an ancestor that had that pentadactyl limb, and due to different selection pressures, there was divergent evolution. But because we all came from a common ancestor with the same anatomical structure, that is definitely evidence for evolution. And then the other thing which can be linked, it's not necessarily evidence for evolution, but it can prove that evolution occurred, is artificial selection. The fact that we as humans are able to select certain characteristics and force those characteristics to be passed down, it shows that in nature, with another selection pressure, it can also select certain characteristics, and then those can be passed down. I haven't gone into mitochondrial DNA because I want to go into mitochondrial DNA when my next video, which will be hominids. So yeah, I'm probably not going to do any more. I need to watch the Grand Prix, which I've waited the whole day to watch, and don't tell me who won. I'm sure it was Max, but we'll, yeah, keep it up. Okay, goodbye.